Hey everybody, ABC 10 meteorologist Brendan Minchef. I'm going to be talking about El Nino and the impacts that has on the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, which starts on Friday, May 15th and concludes at the end of November. So let's jump into it. We'll start with El Nino. I'm not going to do a deep dive into El Nino. My colleague Rob Carlmark has other videos on El Nino doing the deep dives into this El Nino, which is likely to be a very strong, some are calling it a super El Nino. If you want more on that, I suggest you go find one of Rob's videos. You can find that on the ABC 10 app or on the YouTube channel. But we are going to touch on El Nino just a little bit. You can see it's already forming sea surface temperature anomalies across the what we call Niño 3.4 region, roughly the boundaries of this box, about 0.8 degrees Celsius warmer than normal. So again, El Nino is coming, and we've got a lot warmer water starting to upwell just off the western coast of South America here. And with El Nino, these waters spread out across the equatorial Pacific. So as you might imagine, warmer sea surface temperatures can lead to a more active hurricane season. But there's a little bit more to it than that. We'll continue looking at the ocean temperatures here. So this is, imagine, if you will, a cross section. You're looking sideways into the ocean. This is the surface of the ocean, and then 100 meters deep, 200, 300, 400, 500, and so on. So what we see here, we see some very warm water, but what we're really interested in is the anomaly here. We have what's called a Kelvin wave, and this is where you've got warm water that travels under the surface, right? Surface is up here, so we're about 100 to 150 meters deep. Travels across the Pacific underneath the surface of the Pacific, and then upwells off the coast of South America, and then overspreads across the surface. And what we see is we have even warmer water that has not yet reached the surface, 5, maybe 6 degrees Celsius above normal. That's what's on the way. So El Nino is still building. This is why we could see a very strong El Nino, which is 2 degrees Celsius or warmer. This is an international phenomenon, so we're using metric units, right? Meters, Celsius, so on and so on. So again, very strong. And what this is showing us is April, May, June, then the 3-month time frame of May, June, July, August, July, August, September, August, September, October, September, October, November. And what we see is how the chances for El Nino build and build and build as we move through the fall and into the northern hemisphere winter. That darker red color showing the likelihood of a very strong El Nino building. So for hurricane season, which again is May 15th through November 30th, what we see is a strengthening El Nino, getting stronger as the season goes on. But certainly El Nino conditions are expected to be there. Now we're going to stop talking about El Nino and talk about how this impacts hurricane seasons. Again, my colleague Rob Carlmark has deeper dives into El Nino itself. We're talking about hurricane season here. So, of course, there's the Eastern Pacific hurricane season and then the Atlantic hurricane season. Well, with El Nino, it usually means more Pacific hurricanes and fewer Atlantic hurricanes. And the reasons for that are as follows. There's stronger wind shear in the Atlantic typically, stronger trade winds, and a more stable atmosphere. So you don't want wind shear when you're trying to form a hurricane, because that means it just kind of slices the top of a hurricane off and you can't get a well-formed eye going. It's kind of messy. It doesn't allow for hurricane formation to happen when you have strong wind shear. And that's what we typically see across the main development region of the Atlantic in an El Nino hurricane season. But in the Pacific, it's a different story. Less wind shear, it's certainly a much less stable atmosphere, more unstable, if you will, atmosphere because of how warm those sea surface temperatures are. It allows for more thunderstorm development, allows for more convection to happen, and with less wind shear happening, that is when you can get those hurricanes to form. But downstream of that, which would be, again, into the Atlantic, you have stronger wind shear, you have some of the effects of that thunderstorm development happening in the Pacific. It's all tied together at different layers of the atmosphere, but this is the very simple textbook version of it. More hurricanes typically in the Eastern Pacific Basin. So here's the forecast. This is from the Mexican National Weather Service, essentially, the NWS equivalent for Mexico. The National Weather Service has not yet put out an Eastern Pacific Basin forecast for this season. So We're using the SMN forecast, and they're calling for 18 to 21 named storms. That could be a tropical storm, a hurricane, or a major hurricane. 18 to 21. The average is 15 named storms. So of those 18 to 21 named storms, 9 to 11 of those will be a hurricane, according to this forecast. We average about 8 hurricanes a season in the eastern Pacific Basin. And of those 9 to 11 hurricanes, 4 to 5 of those are likely to be a major hurricane. That would be a Cat 3, 4, or 5. We average about 4. So this is an above average season forecast for the eastern Pacific Basin because of, in large part, El Nino forming across the equatorial Pacific. Here's a look at the names. Now, if we get that 18 to 21 named storm season, we're going to end up somewhere over here. We're going to get through the RST, maybe all the way to the V or W names. So we could use up a lot of this list if that more active than normal season does verify. The average first named storm in the eastern Pacific happens on June 10th. The average first hurricane happens on June 26th. And then our average first major hurricane, essentially over the last 30 years, happens on July 15th. Again, this is all for the eastern Pacific. We're not talking about the Atlantic. This is the eastern Pacific Basin. But what do we need for hurricane ingredients? Of course, we need the sea surface temperatures. We talked about that. We also need a low pressure disturbance. We need an area of showers and thunderstorms. This can form off the Pacific coast of Mexico and then start to move out into the warmer waters of the Pacific. In fact, that's what happens quite often. We need warm ocean temperatures, water temperatures of at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit down to about 150 feet or 50 meters. So it can't just be sea surface temperatures. We need it to go 100 to 200 feet or about 50 meters below the surface, because these storms, as they form, they churn up the water, right? You're mixing the water around. If you've got colder water just below the surface, as the waves start to pick up, as the storm tries to form, it's going to mix out that warmer water and everything's going to cool off, which is why you need a fairly deep layer of warm water. And as we looked at El Nino a few minutes ago, and we talked about how warm that water is, even down to about 150 to 200 meters, there you go. You only need about 50 to 100 meters deep of these really warm waters. We obviously have that right now, and we will continue to see that as we go through the hurricane season because of El Nino. We also need low wind shear. That's something else we talked about. With El Nino, we typically have lesser wind shear happening in the Pacific Basin. That essentially means wind shear. There's no big difference in wind speed or direction. If you have a lot of wind shear, you're going to push the top right off the hurricane. It's not going to be able to form. If you think about severe thunderstorms, we do want wind shear, right? We want to tilt that mesocyclone in the storm to really get the severe thunderstorms going. Opposite with hurricanes. You want a very stable, at least stable in terms of wind shear, right? You do want that low pressure disturbance where you get those showers and thunderstorms, but you don't want an area of very strong winds when that storm is forming. Otherwise, you're going to break the storm. Let's talk about, though, why we typically don't see a lot of hurricanes in California. We've talked about how El Nino relates to hurricanes. We've talked about what we need for hurricanes. And remember, two of those big ingredients, warm waters, right, and low wind shear. So one of the things that prevents storms from happening in California fairly often, I'll say, it can happen occasionally, but more often than not, why we don't see storms. One of the big reasons is called the California current. This is a current that brings colder water down from the Gulf of Alaska all the way down the western coast of the United States. Again, hurricanes don't like colder water. So this current, which is particularly strong in the summertime, it's why we're always so much colder than the East Coast. Here's what this current does. We get these surface winds coming out of the northwest, and that pushes this colder water along with the current down the coast of California. But then, because of the rotation of the Earth, water actually pushes away from the coast of California. So even though we're bringing this colder water down right along the immediate coast, because of that rotation of the Earth, the water actually gets pushed back away from the coast. This causes what's known as upwelling. So because you got to replace the water that's being pushed away from the coast, this water's coming from deeper underneath the California current. So this is even colder water because colder water is heavier. It sits lower. So because of this upwelling, your immediate coastline can be much colder than even what's being brought in by the California current itself. It's why when you look, especially in the summertime when the difference is most notable, it's why when you look at a map of like sea surface temperature anomalies, the western coast and especially the California coast is always so much colder than the open Pacific, once you get beyond the current. And that's because of the current itself and because of the upwelling effect. And as I said a minute ago, it's why the California coast is always colder than the East Coast during the summer. At equivalent latitudes, you might have East Coast sea surface temperatures in the 80s. But our average summer sea surface temperature here in California, about 59 degrees off the coast of Crescent City. San Francisco, about 62 degrees. Monterey, a little deeper over there, 59 degrees. LA, 64 degrees. And I mean, the far southern tip of California, you get down towards San Diego, then we're in the low 70s for sea surface temperatures. But remember, hurricanes want sea surface temperatures of at least 80 degrees. We definitely are nowhere near that for the coast of California. Another thing that we typically see that prevents these storms from working their way towards California is the semi-permanent North Pacific high. This high pressure during the summertime usually sits here, doesn't usually move very much. This is one of the reasons why we get so warm, why we're so dry. That storm door is closed. It usually just sits there. So that means all these storms that form off the coast of Mexico, out in the lower Pacific here, they can't work their way up. There's no steering winds to push them north up the Baja coast or even in towards California. So these end up just riding out into the Pacific, more or less towards Hawaii. Occasionally, when that high pressure is weaker or non-existent, does happen sometimes, especially when you get a really strong high pressure ridge across the central U.S., well, now you do actually have some steering winds that can move these storms off the coast of Baja and work their way towards California. Even if this happens, though, you're still fighting a few different things, including, of course, that California current that we just talked about with sea surface temperatures between about 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, even if this is the setup that you have, you still have extremely cold water, at least by hurricane standards, extremely cold water off the coast. So that storm is going to die off very quickly because it loses its entire source of fuel, which of course are those SSTs of 80 degrees or warmer. You also have stronger wind shear with those northwesterly winds typically happening off the coast. And in this setup, you might have some winds working their way up to the south, helping to steer this storm. But the other thing that you've got, and we saw this, if you remember Hurricane Hilary, you have some steep coastal terrain, not just in California, but all the way down through Baja California too. Hurricanes do not like steep terrain. They like it to be flat because it disrupts the wind field of this storm. Even if it's sitting maybe 100 miles off the coast, that's still close enough for some of these stronger hurricanes to be disrupted by mountains like what we've got in Baja, like what we've got up and down the coast of California. We see this same effect sometimes as storms try to work their way through Cuba. Cuba is very mountainous, especially the western side of the island. So if you get a storm working its way through the Caribbean and trying to push up through into the Gulf of Mexico, it usually has to interact in some way with the island of Cuba, which is very mountainous. So a lot of times you will see these storms weaken, even though the sea surface temperatures can be upwards of 90 degrees in this area. Because of that mountainous terrain, it can really weaken a storm. And that's one of the things that we saw with Hurricane Hilary that came through a few years ago. Speaking of Hurricane Hilary, is our most recent tropical system in California, August 16th through 21st of 2023. On August 18th, it was a Category 4 hurricane, 145-mile-per-hour winds. You can see that is a satellite picture of Hurricane Hilary. It made landfall in California on August 20th as a tropical storm. That was down in Southern California. This storm brought the first ever tropical alerts for California. We had tropical storm warnings from San Diego to Los Angeles. Again, we don't usually see these types of storms moving into the Golden State, so it was the first time we ever had these tropical storm warnings or watches for the state. And it brought some record rainfall too. LA, San Diego, Palm Springs all set daily rainfall records. LA set August rainfall records of almost 3 inches, and Death Valley saw more rain in one day, 2.2 inches, than their yearly average, which is 2.15 inches. So it brought a lot of rain to places that don't usually see a lot of rain in the month of August, right? We're usually pretty dry. in August. But this is what the storm looked like when it was away from the coast, when it was still in those warmer waters. As soon as Hilary started to ride up the coast of Baja and in towards the southern parts of Southern California, that you saw the terrain impacted greatly. That wind field started to collapse. As soon as it moved into those colder waters off the coast of Southern California, you saw that eye wall fall apart. It just loses its field. This is a big reason why the terrain and the sea surface temperatures, and especially the sea surface temperatures, it's a big reason why we really do not see these types of storms moving into California. We can definitely get some remnants though, and that's happened a few times. The remnants of these storms as they fall apart, sometimes over Mexico even, can get picked up by the overall weather pattern. And then because it's usually monsoon season in August, we can get some of that moisture. We can get some more humid days, but we don't hardly ever see a lot of wind from these systems, or a lot of rain. I hope that's enlightening for you. I know it was a little bit in the weeds, but that's the point of these kind of weather explainers, is to really dive into a subject, and hopefully you can take something away from it. If you liked these, download the ABC 10 app. It's live, local, always on. You can watch it for free wherever you stream. We've got a weather playlist there with extended forecasts, with more weather explainers, just like this one. I was telling you, we've got some on El Nino that are going up there. So I highly recommend you check those out. We also have some weather and climate specials. That's all on the ABC 10 streaming app. Thanks for watching.